So in this lecture, we're going to talk about the relationship between race and sexual assault. But before we begin, I just want to start with a content warning. As in the book, we describe sexual assaults as students recounted them to us. This material can be hard to hear. It was hard for us to hear, and of course, even harder for many of the students to live. If you need to take a break while listening, please do so. If you wanted to call someone or talk to someone, the RAIN hotline is 1-800-656-HOPE or 1-800-656-4673. Please know that you're never alone. We can't understand sexual assault without thinking about race. And that's because assault is very much about power, and race is inexorably tied to power in American life. In this lecture, we're going to take a deep dive in thinking through the relational and institutional ways in which race influences the sexual lives and the consequent dynamics of sexual assault on college campuses. Though there's little evidence of racial and ethnic differences in the rates of assault, our work shows differences in the kinds of assaults experienced by different racial and ethnic groups. This builds upon our general finding that assault is not one thing, but many different things. And to address assault, we need to think about its many different dimensions. It also makes a more general point about how to think about comparing rates between groups. If the only question you ask is whether the rates are different, you may fail to explore the possibility that similar rates can be the result of starkly different social processes. A core takeaway is that racial equality is a sexual assault prevention strategy. In this lecture, we're going to focus on the experiences of Black students. There's so much more to be said about whiteness, about Asian or Latino experiences, but for now, we want to dive into the experiences of Black students to show how understanding assault requires a racial analysis. When we say that race is relational and institutional, we mean that race is a relationship between people as well as an institutional arrangement that influences people's actions. We can see this clearly with the story of Carl. Carl told us about one night when he met a white woman at a party and how, after some flirting, she asked if they could go back to his room. Carl wasn't comfortable with how drunk she seemed, so he suggested a late-night stroll. After nearly an hour of walking around campus and the surrounding neighborhood, he finally agreed to go back to his room. But he was still worried that she would later claim that she'd been too drunk to consent. Carl believed he needed to protect himself from the racial biases in campus and criminal adjudication processes. He insisted that they sit and talk for a while longer. Only after he judged that she could no longer claim to have been drunk did he consent to sex. But that still wasn't enough to assuage Carl's anxieties. Before she left, Carl secretly recorded the woman, saying she was happy with what had happened. He'd done his homework. Carl knew that New York was a one-party consent state for recording conversations. The recording he'd made without her permission could be admissible as evidence in court. That helped me, Carl said to us. Just really allowed me to feel a lot more comfortable the moment she left. I at least had some evidence for my own conscience. Many of the men that we spoke to expressed a fear of being falsely accused of assault, a fear which we'll note is vastly out of proportion with the actual risk of that happening. But Carl's extreme self-protective measures speak to a broader finding in our research. Black students experience campus sexual violence in significantly different ways from white students. That's in part because of the experience of their race. The Black women that we interviewed reported higher rates of unwanted sexual touching than white women. Black men, the history never far behind in their minds, were far likelier than their white counterparts to worry that consensual sexual encounters with white women would lead to unfounded accusations of assault. The Black students we spoke to described feeling hypersexualized by their peers. Time and again, they told us stories of unwanted sexual touching. One man we interviewed speculated that white women's apparent comfort grabbing his penis in a bar derived both from racialized lack of respect for his bodily autonomy and white fantasies about Black penises. Black women's stories were even more unsettling. Of the 16 Black female students we interviewed, every single one told us a story of unwanted touching. That bears repeating. Every single one.
Every time we say that, it's a lot. The racial dimensions of campus sexual assault aren't simply about personal attitudes and interactions. In our language, they're not just relational, they're also institutional. The geography of campus is deeply connected to race. The unequal organization of social spaces creates opportunities for assault, and many high-value social spaces, such as fraternities, are frequently controlled by men, but not just men in general. Most often, they're wealthy white men. It matters from music to what kinds of substances are on offer. Students of color, and in particular Black students, feel chronically less at home. One student, Charisma, described the mainstream campus social scene as fratty white guys who drink too much, have bad taste in music, can't really dance, and go for skinny girls with straight hair and thin noses. She was frustrated by the relatively small numbers of Black and Latino men whom she deemed more suitable partners. Like other students of color, she described Columbia as a white institution. What that meant was that the socializing that happened on campus wasn't going to be a place where she felt like she could fit in. And so Charisma's search for experiences and people that she wanted to connect with led her to the Brooklyn apartment of a man who she barely knew. They'd been introduced through her roommate and texted back and forth for a couple of weeks. She thought that they just smoke a little pot, chill, and watch TV. Not long after arriving, she felt uncomfortable, but the subway wasn't running and she didn't have the money for a car home. She stayed. He assaulted her. We describe this assault in greater detail in the book. We can't explain her experience through the perspective of gender-based violence alone. A university culture that is racialized made her feel excluded and laid the groundwork for her assault. So did her lack of financial resources. This kind of analysis, what Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectional to describe, is essential to understanding and preventing sexual assault on campus. Existing prevention efforts also have unexamined racial dimensions. A singular focus on alcohol and bystanders, which are common areas of emphasis on many campuses, erases Black women's experiences. That's because assault isn't always the same kind of experience. Sometimes it happens in the context of a hookup or even a drunken hookup when two people have been drinking together at a party. But sometimes it happens in more intimate settings like relationships when people haven't been drinking and they're unlikely to be bystanders. Jaylene told us a story about getting up the courage to stop by the room of an upperclassman on whom she was, in her words, crushing hard. She told him how she felt, and she was thrilled when he reciprocated her interest and suggested that they kiss to see if there's a spark. But her excitement turned to dismay as he pressed her for oral sex. She was horrified, particularly because she had told him that she thought oral sex was kind of gross, and she felt like he knew that because he was her friend. In general, men view Black women as less desirable dating partners, something Jaylene experienced firsthand in trying to find a man on campus who was interested in her. She didn't want to perform oral sex, but she did. Unusually, they discussed it later, and he agreed that he had extracted a yes that she did not want to give. Jaylene was totally sober during that interaction. Generally, Black Americans drink less than white Americans. This is particularly true on college campuses. And so, not surprisingly, an analysis of the survey data from the broader Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation Project that was led by Louisa Gilbert, this is the analysis of the data, found that Black, non-Hispanic female students experienced incapacitated assault at significantly lower rates than white ones. That means that the drunken hookups that predominate in the public conversation cast white students' experiences as universal. The white students we spoke with rarely express fear about the consequences of drinking. In the book, we go into much greater detail about underage drinking as a practice of white privilege, but it's not just racial privilege. It's the intersection of whiteness, wealth, masculinity, heterosexuality, and being cisgender. And we connect that heavy drinking to a broader idea of what it means to do college, calling attention to how class, race, and gender intertwine to disseminate an ideal of college fun that is unequally accessible and perhaps unequally appealing to the actual diversity of today's student body. We also show how some of those inequalities, class, race, and gender, are reflected in the allocation of social space, which amplifies the ways in which students of color perceive Columbia as a white institution. In contrast to their white peers, Black students frequently express the worry about being caught with a fake ID underage drinking, or committing the property damage that can be associated with heavy drinking, they were worried that these things would bring them face to face with law enforcement. Black students were the only ones we spoke with who talked about how those encounters could lead to ending up on the other side of an officer's gun. Sexual assault, on or off campus, is not always just gender-based violence. It can also be racial violence. Such violence can, at times, be an expression of white privilege. A narrow focus on gender inequality may lead to prevention work that, even if it's successful, actually exacerbates racial disparities in campus sexual assault. When we assume all students experience campus life the same way white students do, we erase Black students' bodies and their suffering from public concern.